Alright, hello, my fellow risers. Okay, excellent. Alright, we're all set. Alright, let us finish Losing Ourselves by Garfield, a transformative book that comes with my highest recommendation. The same recommendation that goes to reading Thinking Fast and Slow, The Case Against Reality, A Brief Tour of Human Consciousness, and Behave by Robert Sapolsky. So it's up there. Yeah, it's really important. And you know what? Behave is such a good book, and it lays things out so well. But as far as what's like revolutionary, transformative, I think I'm gonna maybe leave Behave out. And yeah, this book is up there with The Case Against Reality. It's just such good food for thought that will get you thinking new, better thoughts, important, new, better thoughts, consequential, new, better thoughts to replace the consequential, not good thoughts. Okay, so, or not accurate, what have you. It's a red pill book, is what I'm saying. Thinking Fast and Slow, Case Against Reality, and Losing Ourselves. Okay, so chapter 9, Being in the World, Living as a Person. Losing Ourselves by Garfield, Learning to Live Without a Self. So first, he talks about how a self, we typically take ourselves to be these substantial, outside of space and time, singular, continuous things. There is no such thing. That is just a construct, and it's a pernicious one. But you know what's a good construct, a good convention? Seeing yourself as a person instead of a self. Okay, so first he talked about what you think you are, what that self word tends to be associated with. Second, how Buddhist philosophers and scientists have revealed to us that that what we think of as a self is not real or useful. But what is real, constructed real, useful, is recovering as the person. Then we got into the deep shit. I mean, not really. We just got into the complicated stuff about how other philosophers who are clinging to this illusion of a self have elaborated on that illusion, the full illusion of the transcendent self, and then even the watered down illusion of the minimal self. And Garfield just boop, 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 mopped him up. And so then we talked about how like immersion, being in a flow state where there's no awareness of the illusory self, there's no attention to awareness or awareness of it, attention, only awareness of and attention to the objects. And how, yeah, how just great that is. How that's what experts are doing. There is value to being aware of our attention, paying attention to our awareness when we're learning something. But then that becomes an obstacle when we're actually, trying to when we've developed proficiency and we want to take advantage of that proficiency. Then there's ethics. That one I was like, let me sit with that a little bit longer, but basically that like he says that the self illusion is a foundation to bad morality, serves as a foundation to bad morality. I'm skeptical, but it does serve as the foundation to justifications of bad morality. So, then 8, let us, affirm really what this means. This is the chapter I just read, but I'm having trouble doing a little summary of it. I'm too close to it. Yeah, I mean, he just elaborated on the person construction. So we talked about how this sense of self as a subject develops, and it's actually second person first, from which and that's for what we get. First person and third person. This perspective assumes what one might call a second person approach to developing awareness of self and other. Okay, very good. Talked about some theory of mind stuff in that chapter. Oh, and we talked about, I mean, he really went through, explained really nicely how these different layers at which we can, look upon our existence are all beneficial. That no layer that might supervene a base layer can be reduced to that base layer, can be ignored, and then understanding emerge just from looking from that base layer or at that base layer. So yeah, this was a really cool chapter, really good timing for me as well. A really great trip last night. Yeah, and the chapter started with, just because things are constructed doesn't make them not real, not consequential. And this pen was constructed, wasn't it? Okay, so chapter 9, being in the world, living as a person. Yeah. Menards, great. Awesome. We can go pick that up. Yeah, I mean, I'm not. We don't have to pick it up now. Excellent. Okay. Excellent. All right, great. I'll try not to dilly dally, but also try not to get a copyright strike. Okay. Bees and hives. Human beings, although so like other animals in some respects, are unusual in the animal kingdom in other very important respects. One of those respects, of course, is our use of language. Language is a signaling system that fulfills some of the purposes served by other. Oh, language is a signaling system that fulfills some of the purposes served by other animal communication systems. But because of its recursivity, flexibility, and expressive power, language comes to reshape our cognition and to enable our complex societies, a point to which we will return shortly. Human language is made possible by 3 distinct conditions, each of which is important in constituting us as persons. Okay, human language is made possible by three distinct conditions. One, we require the neurobiological adaptations that subserve language acquisition and use. One, we are biologically wired for language, and without this wiring, it would be impossible for us to learn it or use it. Oh, I wish were here. This is a valuable. No, that's absolutely okay. That's an attachment to an expectation, an urgent need to like communicate a thing. But all is good. We are biologically wired, but this is relevant to my discussion with Om. I'll put it that way. That when they suggest it kind of exclusively, I don't know, that's what I inferred anyway, kind of exclusively seeing the self as just a locus of awareness. We miss out on all the things that are worth learning about the self, or a lot of them. We are biologically wired for language, and without this wiring, it would be impossible for us to learn or to use it. And to really just know that you are not beholding reality as it is. These mechanisms are producing representations or are just constructing things that, yeah, it's somewhat based on reality, and it's in order to operate in reality, but just it is not reality. So we are biologically wired for language, and without this wiring, it would be impossible for us to learn or to use it. So I read that sentence 3 times, and it relates to like what I'm saying. That's so important to understand that there is a universe in which a being like you in some ways. Well, I mean, obviously he's making the point that, language makes us super different, but still I'm going to say this sentence. There's a being that is like you in many ways, but has no capacity for language, and so is very, very unlike you. But yeah, I guess, could you even consider being intelligent? But this is the point. Trying to like imagine this is beyond my biology. I mean, it may be possible with the right sort of inputs and so on to get the neurons interacting in such a way that I can conceive of the things that I'm trying to conceive. But there are some things that you just can't conceive of. We are constrained by our biology. We are determined by our biology. Yeah, which is also determined by our psychology, sociality, whatever. Okay, second, we have been selected in our evolution because of the success that language confers in the human social niche. Okay, so that's 2. Okie dokie. Made possible. That is, we have evolved to use language, and by using language, we have created a linguistic niche that ensures that selection pressure will prefer those who are linguistically competent. Niche is as important as biology in determining what kinds of creatures we become, because we are embedded in that environment, aren't we? Sweet. Finally, we must have a propensity to recognize and to be governed by systems of conventional norms. That is, we must be tuned not only to notice and to conform to regularities in the behavior of those among whom we live, but also to take those regularities to constitute norms that bind us. Okay, this is the way that people are saying things, and this is how I have to say things. You also don't want to be 100% constrained by that, but it is valuable to be directed by that. That there are norms, there are conventions that we agree on. We must, in other words, take conformity to those regularities to be obligatory. This suggests that we have evolved to recognize and to respect norms of various kinds, and we have thereby created a social niche that in turn reinforces that evolutionary pressure. These are among the most important social structures responsible for enabling the social roles that constitute us as persons. Linguistic rules and conventions are what make meaning possible. Words are meaningful only because there are rules governing their use. These rules constitute the distinction between correct and incorrect usage that underlies meaning. But there are countless other conventions or customs that acquire normative force through establishing patterns of behavior so central to our lives that we live those lives only through the confidence that we have in the regularity of those patterns. Think, for instance, of the custom of driving on a particular side of the road or of stopping for a red light. Customs of greeting, of making and keeping promises, of paying for what we purchase also structure our lives. And there are countless more. Human beings seem to have evolved to seek, to detect, and then to rely on regularities in one another's behavior. So my mother called me, said, babe, well, she doesn't say babe, I don't know why I said that. Son, did you post a video talking about shrooms while under the influence of shrooms, bro, and say that that was what was happening, bro? And I was like, yes. And I think at some point in the conversation I say, it is valuable for like 10% of people to be in defiance of the norms. Because that's how you get new norms. That's how you get better norms. But it definitely is discomforting to people. What happened? Ah, I see. You turn the gas off? Gotcha. Once again, this biological and psychological feature leads us to structure our social lives and our cultures around networks of customs. Those cultures then create niches. Those cultures then create niches in which the ability to detect and the tendency to respect custom are selected. All of this generates a virtuous spiral, a spiral that produces our highly regulated lives and social orders. This regulation, paradoxically, is what makes it possible for us to be the creative individuals we are. For creativity requires meaning, mutual recognition, and forms of life in which it makes sense to be creative. Yeah. Yeah, so you can't, yeah, right. So you can't like defy the norm completely. It has to be slight. It has to still depend on use certain norms. There's definitely a balance to find. Because yeah, communication's not possible if I'm just going like that. So that could mean like go away or stop it. But what if I'm like, no, that's not what I meant by that. Oh, okay. Well, all right. So you can be creative without respecting any norms, but just nobody's gonna understand it, and it's not gonna achieve any of the normal purposes of creativity except to set an example that other things are possible, which is valuable as well. David Hume referred to this as the concealed influence of custom. Before Hume, English legal theorists such as John Fortescue and Edmund Burke had argued that habitual patterns of behavior naturally become social customs, that social customs naturally lead participants in the societies in which they arise to expect conformity to them, and that these expectations of conformity naturally become norms, which in turn are codified in laws. To say that we are creatures of custom is thus not simply to note our propensity for regularity or mutual imitation. It is to identify one of the deepest aspects of our nature, one that allows us to be social, and hence that enables us to develop the qualities we cultivate in early parent-child interactions. To say that we are creatures of custom is thus not simply to note our propensity for regularity or mutual imitation. It is to identify one of the deepest aspects of our nature, one that allows us to be social, and hence that enables us to develop the qualities that we had cultivated in early parent-child interactions into those that constitute us as adult persons. That is the propensity not only to imitate, but to take behavioral convergence to be normative. If we turn from a Scottish to an Indian Buddhist context, we also find an account of persons as conventional or lokavihara entities. So if we turn from Scottish to an Indian Buddhist context, we also find an account of persons as conventional entities that only exist in the context of everyday interactions. This account was, as we have seen, developed by Buddhist philosophers as a critique of the view that a human being is or possesses an independently existent self or Atman. To say that we are socially constructed is, according to this tradition, not just to say that some superficial properties such as our social status or occupations are constructed socially, or that some of our preferences and habits reflect our cultures. All of that is true, but Buddhist philosophers think that it only scratches the surface. Convention or custom constitutes our own identity and the nature of the world we inhabit. We can spell this idea out in terms of Vasudevi Reddy's idea that to be a person is to be an addresser and an addressee, and that it is to be one who takes oneself and others to be interlocutors, a status that is only achievable and only comprehensible in a social context. So we can spell this idea out in the terms of Vasudevi Reddy's idea that to be a person is to be an addresser and an addressee, and that it is to be one who takes oneself and others to be interlocutors, a status that is only achievable and only comprehensible in a social context. If we take this aspect of personhood as seriously as I have been arguing that we must, it follows that our very being, like the institutions in the context of which we function, is socially constructed. We are essentially social animals, or as Bernard Mandeville would have put it, complicated bees. One does not come to understand a beehive by studying individual bees and then just scaling up. Instead, one understands an individual bee by understanding how a hive works and what that bee's role is therein. You don't first observe a lot of theatrical roles and then put them all together to figure out what the theater is. Instead, you understand a theatrical role by first knowing about the theater, about the company. The same is true regarding our understanding of persons. One does not come to understand our cultures by understanding how an individual Homo sapiens organism works and then scaling up. One understands how a person works by understanding our cultures and our multiple roles therein. And there is no place for a self in the story that these analogies suggest. We are too bound up with others for that. This means that in order to understand who we are and what our lives are, we must take the social level of analysis at least as seriously as we do the psychological and the biological. So, section Adult Subjectivity and Personhood. We saw in the previous chapter how our subjectivity develops in second person interactions, and that we can only know ourselves as subjects to the extent that others address us and that we address others in the context of a mutual expectation of understanding. As we acquire language, we come to address one another in that medium, and our self-understanding, as well as our understanding of others, is permeated by the metaphor of linguistic meaning. When we ascribe others' beliefs, desires, intentions, hopes, and fears, we do so by ascribing by ascribing content to their mental states that we express in sentences. We believe that grass is green, desire that our party wins the election, fear that they won't, etc. When we ascribe contentful mental states to others, something we do constantly, we neither observe nor hypothesize that there are little sentences in their brains. That would be impossible. There are no such little sentences inscribed in neural matter, and even if there were, we could never see them. Instead, we engage in an act of interpretation, using sentences and the meaningfulness of language as a model by means of which to understand human behavior and cognition, a way of making sense of what we and others do. Thus, language is one more metaphor that mediates our understanding of one another. It is less obvious, but no less true, that we do the same when we come to understand ourselves. We describe our own beliefs, intentions, and so forth in linguistic terms as well, and we do so without observing or positing inner sentences. That's not a denial of inner speech. He's saying that, so let's say you talk to yourself, you do some inner speech. You say, oh my gosh, I am so over this. You say that to yourself. Well, so that was you describing your belief or your emotion or your mood, whatever, in linguistic terms. And to do that, even though you did it in your head, you didn't first observe or posit an inner sentence. You first had a cognitive moment and then posited an inner sentence. This is the only way that we can understand ourselves, in a constant act of auto-interpretation. Once language is in the picture, any pre-linguistic innocence that guides our interactions is lost forever. For this is the moment when we become fully responsible to a norm constituting community in order to make and to absorb meaning. I don't think I understand that bit. When we join the community of language users, we tacitly agree to follow the rules for usage of linguistic terms that are enforced by our community. When we learn to reason, we learn to conform to the rules of reasoning respected in our community. When we learn to claim knowledge, we learn to conform to the epistemic norms of our community. When we use language as a model for thought, we import all of these commitments to our understanding of one another and of ourselves. To regard ourselves or others as thinkers is hence to regard ourselves and others as members of a community that constitutes and that is constituted by norms. We should remember that the word I is first and foremost a linguistic item. So when I use the first person pronoun, I undertake certain commitments, the kinds of commitments essential to participation in a linguistic community. These commitments depend both on the fact that to speak is always to address another, and on the fact that to speak is to agree to use the words I utter in conformity with the grammatical and semantic rules that govern my language. In particular, to use I is to take my addressees to be capable of being addressed as you, to be persons who can also use I to express their own subjectivity, who can understand what I say, and who can address me as you. It is also to regard others as he, she, or they, that is, to recognize a broad linguistic and social community that institutes and enforces the norms that make speech and address possible. Yeah, probably no. I guess what the fourth person would be. Oh, I had it for a second. The fourth person, I guess basically just the quickest way to say it would be God. Like, because he's like omnipresent. So some kind of an entity that is I, you, and they. I don't know. But, again, there is a being that could conceive of a fourth person, could have that in their grammar. I would doubt that any language has a fourth, any human language has ever had a fourth person. Well, I'd be really interested in the exception. So, in short, the possibility of speech, and hence of adult subjectivity, since we understand the contents of our own minds in terms of categories derived from speech, depends on intersubjectivity. So the possibility of speech depends on intersubjectivity. And this, to repeat, is simply because speech presupposes both addressees who can be expected themselves to be subjects and a context of meaning constituted conventions instituted by others whose subjectivity we also presume. Okie dokie. So, even our own self knowledge, and therefore also adult human subjectivity, in which we recognize ourselves as persons, are essentially intersubjective phenomena, not private phenomena. To be a person truly is to be an ensemble player, not a soloist, and in more senses than one. Yeah. Any account of how we know ourselves and others, according to which we first encounter ourselves, then our immediate. Okay, any account of how we know ourselves and others, according to which we first encounter ourselves, then our immediate interlocutors, and then others, building our understanding of others by analogy to that we have of ourselves, is hence incoherent. So, any account of how we know ourselves and others, any account according to which we first encounter ourselves, then our immediate interlocutors, and then others, and building our understanding of others by analogy to what we started with, ourselves, as we would if we were selves instead of persons, is hence incoherent. Okay. Instead, we come in infancy to understand ourselves and our interlocutors together. And of course, that's the only thing that really makes sense given our evolution, our biology. Like, how would a brain coming in, hello, mother? Why would that brain just, hold on a second, developing sense of self? Okay, now, what are you? You're another self? Oh, okay, got you. No, of course, it's like, okay, I am an object of this subject. Oh, that's also an object of this subject. I think that makes sense. So instead, we come to infancy to understand ourselves and our interlocutors together. This understanding becomes articulate and reflective through the mediation of language and a raft of other social conventions. And this mediation is possible only in the context of a seamless understanding both of the community in which we participate and of our mutual relations to one another in that community. Relations that constitute the normativity that makes understanding possible. This takes us to another aspect of personhood and another that distinguishes it from selfhood. To perceive someone as a person, whether myself, my partner, or a stranger, is to see them as making sense, as having meaningful thoughts, and as saying things that have meaning. But to take something to make sense, and so to take someone to have a cognitive or an affective life, to play a social role, is always an interpretive act, whether that interpretation is explicit or implicit. So this takes us to another aspect of personhood and another that distinguishes it from selfhood. To perceive someone as a person is to see them as making sense, as having meaningful thoughts, as being subjects, I guess, as saying things that have meaning, that the words that they're saying represent cognitive activity that is over there, in there, that is different from this cognitive activity. Except thanks to our conventions, that is now similar now that I've heard the words. But to take something to make sense, and so to take someone to have a cognitive or an affective life, to play a social role, is always an interpretive act, whether that interpretation is explicit or implicit. The sapience in adult Homo sapiens therefore always arises through our mutual interpretation, so is always beholden to norms, and so is always collective. In taking myself to be a person, I take you to be a person. In taking you to be a person, I take them to be persons. That is, I take all of us to be committed and responsible to norms of reasonable interpretation. I mean, I think it probably would have been better to say, in taking you to be a person, I take myself to be a person. And in taking myself to be a person, I take them to be persons. That is, I take all of us to be committed and responsible to norms of reasonable interpretation. I also take all of us all to be collectively committed to the constitution of a rule-governed linguistic community in the context of which meaning can be constituted, and so in which fully articulate address is possible. This all means that we create ourselves and one another as persons in the context of our social interactions that constitute the structures and institutions that allow us to live lives that make sense and that allow us to make sense of our lives. And these interactions themselves are only possible between persons who constitute, are bound by, and are constituted by being bound by the norms those interactions institute. And these interactions themselves are only possible between persons who constitute, are bound by, and are constituted by being bound by the norms those interactions institute. This is not as circular as it sounds. Think of it more as one more instance of the spiral we encountered earlier, grounded in our predisposition as social apes to recognize one another and to recognize ourselves in others' eyes, as well as our predisposition to learn language and to be sensitive to and to conform to the behavioral regularities we observe around us. These predispositions enable and encourage us gradually to enter into the linguistic and social practices of our communities and to recognize others and ourselves as persons, playing our respective roles in a common social space, a web. The social space we thereby collaborate in constructing in turn shapes all of us. The social space we thereby collaborate in constructing in turn shapes all of us. It is also instrumental in selecting for individuals who will thrive in that space, creating this social, behavioral, and evolutionary spiral. Participation in this spiral, as I have been emphasizing, is natural to us. We have evolved for just such a life in which we create customs and in which custom creates us. And as Hume notes, that influence of custom is often concealed. That is, we participate in customs of which we may be only dimly or tacitly aware, but which nonetheless shape us, such as those that determine the grammar of our languages and the meanings of the words we use, as well as other subtle social regularities to which we become attuned. So other customs, such as those that govern driving, some aspects of etiquette or political behavior, might require our more explicit awareness and endorsement. But even so, we might note two important qualifications. First, the variability to become aware of such customs and the tendency to conform to them itself And first, the very ability to become aware of such customs and the tendency to conform to them itself rests on psychological dispositions of which we may be unaware, as well as the pervasive influence of language. Second, even those conventions into which we enter voluntarily shape us in ways of which we might be unaware. Politics, etiquette, sport, and the other institutions in which we participate shape our thought, our values, and in turn give rise to yet another niche in which we as a species evolve. We are hence constructed as persons both by our intentional, conscious participation in social structures and by our tacit participation in them. That construction includes both attitudes and roles of which we are explicitly aware and those that may be merely implicit. To be shaped by and to shape this spiral requires us to be in constant open causal interaction with our physical and social environment. It requires that our behavior and thought are conditioned by that environment. This is the flexibility and the embeddedness of persons, not the isolation and constancy of selves. Indeed, there is no place for the self, for the serpent in the wall in this story. At best, it would be a fifth wheel. In fact, as I have argued, it is an incoherent posit. This all brings us back to what is right about Evan Thompson's suggestion that we have narrative selves, a suggestion we considered and rejected in Chapter 6. We can now see more clearly why the idea that narrative is central to our identity is correct and why the idea that it constructs a self is wrong. Okay? The idea that narrative is central to our identity is absolutely correct. But the idea that the narrative constructs a self, wrong. Among our central social practices we learn early on and in which we engage throughout our lives, are storytelling and narrative explanation. We tell stories in conversation, at bedtime, in the high art of the novel or the opera, when we introduce ourselves, when we describe ourselves, when we describe others, and on and on. For most of us, it would be hard to identify a day in which we did not tell someone, if only ourselves, at least a brief story. And we use those stories to make sense of our behavior and attitudes in specific circumstances and to make sense of the biographical arcs of our lives. We explain our decision to take a bus rather than to drive a car by talking about how our commitment to the environment structures our life, or our decision to vote for this candidate rather than that one by how her candidacy enhances the life we lead. In eulogies, we strive to present the life of the departed as a coherent whole. Narrative is perhaps the most important vehicle for achieving self-understanding. Philosophers such as Friedrich Nietzsche, as well as the contemporary scholars Daniel Hutto and Evan Thompson, get this exactly right. But there is a dark side to narrative as well. For one thing, as we saw in Chapter 3, we are not the sole authors of the stories in which we participate, and some of these tales may be deeply destructive. For another, it is all too easy to take the characters in the narratives we co-author to exist independently of the stories, and just as we shouldn't ever think that Hamlet has any reality outside of the play, we shouldn't ever think that we as persons have any reality outside of the narratives in which we participate. In one sense, we are as fictional as Shakespeare's creations. We are constituted as characters through the telling of a story. We are absolutely real within the bounds of that story. We are created, not discovered, and we have no reality at all outside of the context of the stories in which we figure. This is why we are persons, not selves. But we are real persons and not imaginary persons. Therefore, in another sense, we are different from Hamlet and his cohort. And that difference is every bit as important as the similarity. Shakespeare's fiction is local, optional, and its roles need not be instantiated. The fiction in which we play our parts is global and mandatory. And the roles we play are necessarily instantiated by biologically real creatures. We, unlike literary persons, are embodied, embedded, and inactive in our world. All three of these differences are important. So let us take them in turn. So let's talk about being embodied, embedded, and inactive. We begin with the distinction between the local and the global. Plays, novels, short stories, and fairy tales, unlike news reports, biographies, and histories, create characters and their contexts that are independent eddies within the larger current of life. Eddies? I don't know what that is, eddies. While these characters and contexts hang together internally, they are dissociated from and often inconsistent with the characters and contexts we share in ordinary life. Anyway, I think it's just a metaphorical. I think it's just some object that is in the water. Okay. While these characters and contexts hang together internally, they are dissociated from and often inconsistent with the characters and contexts we share in ordinary life. They don't have birth certificates. Nobody outside of these stories interacts physically with them. They have no direct impact on history. However much indirect impact they may have through our reading. Right. Gotcha. Yeah. Those of us who figure in our own grand social narrative, however, are connected globally to one another and to history. Our lives have broad and direct effects on countless others. We leave traces that span reality and that are not confined between the covers of a book or to the minds of those who read it. But isn't it confined to the minds of those who interact with us? This globality of the narrative in which we figure is one important difference between imaginary and real fictional characters. While it doesn't undermine our fictional status, it is one aspect of our lives that confers on us the reality that facts enjoy, making us both fictional and factual. That is what it is for us to enact our personhood. Okie dokie, enact. We have a choice regarding whether to read Hamlet and a choice regarding whether to take the story. We have a choice regarding whether to read Hamlet and a choice regarding whether to take the story and the characters Shakespeare offers us seriously. It is an optional fiction. We have no choice, however, regarding whether to take seriously the story in which we play our parts. To be sure, we are forced to make choices about how the roles we play are articulated, choices that at least partly determine the narrative arcs of our lives and of those with whom we interact, but we are forced to make those choices. We cannot simply opt out of or ignore the stories in which we figure as protagonists. As Heidegger puts it, we are thrown, geworfen, into the worlds we inhabit. As a consequence of this thrownness, we cannot disregard others any more than we can disregard ourselves. We cannot choose to disbelieve or to set aside the narratives that confer personal identities and roles on us. Even to turn away when our attention is demanded, even to shirk our moral or social responsibilities, is to participate, however unwillingly, in these dramas. To act in bad faith is still to act. All of this is to say that the narratives that constitute us as persons also constitute our world, and so are mandatory fictions. This mandatoriness is another aspect of our human life that confers facthood on it, that constitute its truth, however fictional that truth might be. That is what it is for us to be embedded in our world. Finally, we should observe that the characters in literary works remain abstract in an important sense. Those roles are played only when they are deliberately staged, and even when they are staged, those who play them do so only for a short time. And that role playing is itself a subpart of the roles those actors play as persons, even when those are the roles of professional actors. Moreover, these literary roles are independent of anyone who might play them. Hamlet might be performed by St. Laurence Olivier or by Benedict Cumberbatch, but the role remains the same. And neither Olivier nor Cumberbatch actually becomes a Shakespearean character in playing that role. Our roles as persons, however, are closely tied to specific biological organisms, to particular members of species Homo sapiens. We are born to play these roles, and we have only limited choice regarding them. That is what it is for us to be embodied and to be embedded in the world into which we are thrown, and to enact ourselves as persons in that collectively constituted world. For all of these reasons, we can draw a distinction between what is true and what is false within the domain of the fictional, and that is to distinguish between what we can and must trust and what we can't take too seriously. We fall on the true side. Hamlet, Ahab, and Bilbo Baggins lie on the false side. However real they may be within the more limited fictions they inhabit, their reality does not leak into the domain in which we enact our personhood. But we cannot infer from that we have any existence outside of that grand global narrative. We are not independent selves, but interdependent persons. The problem of other minds. These reflections sometimes take us to surprising places. We have been talking about what it is to be a person. To recognize someone as a person is in part to recognize them as someone who can be understood as possessing a mind. And as we have seen, to understand ourselves as persons is to understand ourselves as members of communities of persons, and therefore to recognize others as persons as well. All of this is rather obvious, but this situation both raises and solves a philosophical problem generally called the problem of other minds. It is useful at this point to see both why that problem is sometimes thought to require a solution and why it never even arises in ordinary life. The problem of other minds bothers a lot of people and arises in multiple traditions at many times in the history of philosophy. While I believe that it is a pseudo-problem, it can easily grip us, but its grip loosens as we dissolve the self-illusion. In a nutshell, the problem of other minds goes like this. I know immediately that I have a mind because I am directly and intimately aware of my own inner cognitive and affective life. But when I see others, all I see is their external behavior. How do I know that they are not automata, simulations of persons, philosophical zombies with no inner mental states or minds at all? So, I don't entirely know where he's going with this. I'm not, I'm ready to receive this, but it does remind me of the how with consciousness the philosophical zombie thing just becomes nonsense to me, since I've dissolved for myself the illusion of consciousness. And so I think this is going to be very similar. Excellent. Okay, here we go. So how do I know that they're not just philosophical zombies? Well, I can't know this by perception, since minds are not perceptible, and I can't know it by inference, since everything I observe is consistent with the automaton hypothesis. I disagree. I think an automaton would have inner states. That's my problem with the philosophical zombie. So I can't even know it by induction, since the only case I have is my own, and by hypothesis I may be very different from others, and so cannot infer from my own case, leaving aside the fact that it is but a single case. So how do I know that anyone else has a mind? And this is the problem. I hope that you can feel its grip. Oh yeah, wait, how do I know? Well, I guess you don't know, but also you don't have a mind. So anyway, but let's see what he says. As Wittgenstein saw in his philosophical investigations, the problem of other minds, so posed, is a double problem, concerning both our knowledge of other minds and the very meaning of the vocabulary we use to talk about minds. Hold on. So sometimes I get jealous, right? Like, gosh, Eris, why aren't you more like Wittgenstein, prolific, writing all this stuff, or David Foster Wallace, just like these young guys who. And the reason that I feel funny about it is because I think that, well, that correlates to like their skill and so on. And so then I just don't have that skill of reflection. And in many ways I might not, but also there are so many other factors. And so I was able to remind myself of that, and I'm just saying it out loud so that I can sort of make it concrete for myself, to remind myself, let it stick, is that even if I never have a book, even if I'm never cited, that's okay. I still am leading a meaningful life of exploring these things, of making it possible to be cited, and making it possible that some of the things I say might be assembled into a publication. And 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 that's wonderful. Something like that. So, as Wittgenstein saw in his philosophical investigations, the problem of other minds so posed is a double problem concerning both our knowledge of other minds and the very meaning of the vocabulary we use to talk about minds. The first aspect of the problem is that, as we just saw, we have neither perceptual nor inferential knowledge of the minds of others, and no good inductive reasons for thinking that others have minds at all. The second aspect of the problem is deeper. If we can never know whether an attribution of inner states to others is true or false, not because the evidence happens to be hard to get, but because nothing would even count as evidence, we literally could have no idea what it would be for these attributions to be true or false. To put this another way, if our only concept of a mind is that of our own mind, to say that others have minds would be to say that they have our minds, which makes no sense whatsoever. But here's the real sting in this problem. Right, okay, I get it. And that we could definitely elaborate on that, but we have 10 pages. Okay, let's spend a moment with that. So let's read that again. The second aspect of the problem is deeper. If we can never know whether our attribution of inner states to others is true or false, we literally could have no idea what it would be for those attributions to be true or false. Wait, what? If we can never know whether our attribution of inner states to others is true or false. Oh, if it's not possible to find out whether it's true or false, then we don't know, like, we can't really know what it would mean for it to be true or false. Not sure. But to put this another way, if our only concept of a mind is that of our own mind, okay, so I am conceptualizing my mind. I'm thinking about being a mind. Okay. I'm seeing myself as a mind. I am seeing myself as a mind. Okay. Now, but that is like couched in my first. No, I can't articulate this, but I do think I understand this. And I would definitely love to review this. So to put this another way, if our only concept of a mind is the concept we get from here of our own mind, then when we talk about other people having minds, how do you like separate the meanness from just the mindness? Isn't the mindness couched in the meanness? Seeing it's something like that. Okay. So, but here's the real sting in this problem. If we don't know what we mean when we attribute psychological states to others, we don't know what we mean when we attribute them to ourselves either. This is because the very problem arises regarding how we can understand others to be like us in having minds, which is the problem of what it is to have a mind in the first place. If we don't know what their minds are, we don't know what ours are either. Yeah, this is troubling, suggesting an intolerably deep self-alienation. It is important to feel this perplexity so as to diagnose it and get rid of it once and for all. And this perplexity is deeply connected to the topic at hand. We can now see that the problem of other minds arises from thinking of ourselves and of others as selves, as isolated, independent loci of subjectivity, with our subjective worlds located in interior spaces immediately available to us and impenetrable to others. Only if we start by thinking of minds this way can we get the problem going, for only then are our minds immediately available to us and those of others opaque. And as we have seen, thinking about minds and about ourselves this way is almost irresistible. It is the irresistibility of the self-illusion that makes the problem of other minds so irresistible as well, since they stand and fall together. But now that we have learned to resist the temptation of the self-illusion, we can dissolve the problem of other minds once and for all. Whoa, what? The apparent problem arises from what looks like a vast difference between our knowledge of our own psychological states and those of others. If our own mental states are immediately available to us, but those of others are invisible, there is no possibility of understanding mental state ascription or knowing the minds of others. But as we have seen, this impossibility has a nasty consequence. There would also be no possibility of knowing our own inner states. This is because to know our own states is to know them as instances of kinds of states, as pains, longings, or beliefs that Ulaanbaatar is the cap. This is because to know our own states is to know them as instances of kinds of states, as pains, longings, or beliefs that Ulaanbaatar is the capital of Mongolia. If I do not know that my belief is a belief, or do not know what its content is, I don't really know it. But we can only know... Hello, move over here. Give me in the center, bro. No, sorry, actually, that's perfect, actually. I'm really glad about this, actually. Damn, that just froze. That's alright. Because I'm just going to move this like that. It's wonderful. Great. So if I do not know that my belief is a belief, or do not know what its content is, then I don't really know it. But we can only know kinds if we know them to have multiple instances. To know that this rose is red requires me to be able to recognize multiple roses and to know what it is not, only for this rose to be red, and also for a fire engine to be red. You know, we shouldn't expect to understand everything on the first read anyway, so. The same goes for minds and mental states. To recognize anything as a mind is to recognize it as one of a class of things, and to recognize something as a belief that Ulaanbaatar is the capital of Mongolia is to recognize it as an instance of states of that kind. This goes for my mind and mental states as much as it does for the minds and mental states of others. Alright, we'll just restart it. I don't like being beheld. It triggers something in me to know that I am being beheld. And so just another reason that it's nice to have this surveillance up is that I can look over here to see baby without looking over there and baby seeing me. Or, you know, me seeing that baby seeing me. The same goes for minds and mental states. To recognize anything as a mind is to recognize it as one of a class of things, and to recognize something as a belief that Ulaanbaatar is the capital of Mongolia is to recognize it as an instance of states of that kind. This goes for my mind and mental states as much as it does for the minds and mental states of others. So I cannot know my own mind without knowing that there are others, and I cannot know my own mental states without knowing them as instances of mental states that others entertain as well. And here lies the key to the solution of the problem of other minds. The fundamental premise that generates the problem is the supposition that psychological concepts don't have that kind of generality. Okay. This is the key. Fundamental premise that generates the problem is a supposition that psychological concepts don't have that kind of generality because I'm a special self. That is, the problem of other minds rests on the assumption that I know my own mind and mental states, not as instances of kinds, but directly. It also presupposes that I can't know the minds and states of others in the same way, and once we make that move, given their apparent interiority, it follows that we cannot know them in any other way. But when we take the second person perspective seriously, though, our status as persons instead of as selves provides the clue to the way out of this particular fly bottle. The problem of other minds gets going by inviting us to think of our psychological states as existing independent of our interpretation and context, like pebbles on the beach of our consciousness to be discovered and examined, and as lying in our interior while everything else is exterior. And if we think that each of us has a private inner beach, and that each of us knows our inner lives just by examination of independently existing facts, we're stuck. But when we take seriously the fact that we are always interpreting one another, and even interpreting ourselves, that we are characters whose psychology we and others author together, the gulf between ourselves and others vanishes, along with the metaphor of the inner private world. For on this model, our understanding of our own minds and of those of others arises not from the discovery of primordial facts, but instead from acts of interpretation. It follows from the interpretive character of this knowledge that, like all acts of interpretation, our judgments about the contents of minds, whether our own or someone else's, are answerable only to the standards of cogency and good sense that we use to evaluate good readings of a text or interpretations of a work of art. We do not ask whether these judgments correspond to a pre-existing reality, the nature of which is independent of interpretation. The important point is that this goes both for self-understanding and for the understanding of others. The same conceptual categories and the same acts of interpretation that give us knowledge of our own minds give us knowledge of those of others. And without knowing those others, we could not even know ourselves. To treat our understanding of ourselves and others in terms of interpretation is not to deny that there is any truth of the matter regarding what we think and how we feel. To treat our understanding of ourselves and others in terms of interpretation is not to deny that there is any truth of the matter regarding what we think and how we feel, to assert that anything goes. This is because interpretation does not reflect so much as constitute the reality of our cognitive lives. Any interpretation, whether of Hamlet or of my mind, stands or falls on the grounds of its harmony with all of our other interpretations, and that harmony is sufficient to constitute truth. Its absence is sufficient for a falsehood. That is, while the entire ensemble of social and interpretive conventions in which we participate may constitute the context in which it is true that I believe that Ulaanbaatar is the capital of Mongolia, once that context is in place, there is a clear fact of the matter regarding whether or not I hold this belief. This is no different from how we already understand most of our norm-constituted institutions. As we saw earlier, nobody believes that we just discover money. We create it, and we do so by interpreting various bits of paper, metal, and states of computing machinery as having monetary value. In virtue of that interpretation, those values become real. Money, that is, gets its very existence as well as its value through our collective acts of interpretation, not through any pre-existing reality on which we stumbled. It is fictional. But this does not mean that there is no truth of the matter regarding whether a particular piece of paper is a dollar note or what my bank balance is. There is fact within that fiction. The creation of the fiction and its globality, mandatoriness, and use constitute its truth. And the fact that in the United States we simply decided to drive on the right does not make it any less of a fact that that is the correct side on which to drive in the United States. Instead, that is what makes it a fact in the first place. That is, while the whole system is created, once created, it in turn creates a context in which particular statements can be true or false in virtue of the interpretations already assigned to others. That is how it is with us when considered not as hominids, but as persons. I'm getting it more and more. I wonder what the effect would be. I wonder how would someone respond if they really like took it in and processed this? Because otherwise they would be like, yeah, yeah. But if I want to know if they really took it and processed this, what the response would be. If you say to some religious person, like an Abrahamic religious person, that they really like let it soak in and thought about it in other ways, that they were created, that they're not like real intelligence, that they are, that they were made out of clay. That, and then they could say, well, yeah, but the clay is just our bodies, and then life was breathed into us. And I would be like, okay, but that life energy, you're just saying that's a piece of God, so it's primordial? Got you. Okay. But anyone who believes that God created that energy, I think there's a way to frame it where the person feels less real. They shouldn't, but that they would, because of this tendency we have to think of constructed things as artificial and artificial things as not real. Okay. But wait, you might protest. Maybe this goes for mental states like beliefs, but there's still a problem about what it feels like to be me, about sensory experience. Even if I might know that others can think, how can I know that they feel anything? I mean, feelings are really just thoughts, basically. Kind of, yeah. Maybe their lights are on, but nobody is home. Yo, Akio again. What's good, buddy? Maybe their lights are on, but nobody's home. I at least know that I feel as well as think. So the problem of other minds hasn't really been solved. This is a powerful intuition, and it is closely related to Zahavi's idea that our own experience has for-me-ness. It is part and parcel of the supposition that we are selves. The reply is therefore also closely related to our reply to that idea in chapter 5. Okay? The idea that I might have an inner life while others don't raises the possibility of what contemporary philosophers such as David Chalmers call zombies. A zombie in this sense is a being that is exactly like us cognitively and behaviorally, but that lacks any inner life or real sensory experience. To worry that I alone have such an inner life is to suppose that others might be zombies. We will now see why that makes no flippin' sense, and so that the supposition that others may have no inner life despite being like me in all other respects makes no sense either. Suppose that there are zombies, since in order for this version of the problem of other minds to make any sense, these zombies must be just like us in all respects except for their inner life. They share with us the conviction that they have inner lives, including sensory experience. On this supposition, however, they are wrong. This is such nonsense. But how could they be? Imagine arguing with someone who sincerely believes that she has sensory experience and trying to convince her that she does not. Better yet, ask yourself, are you a zombie? You will probably reply that you know that you are not, but notice that you can't know that, since if you were a zombie, you would believe that you have an inner life just as you do now. There is no way you could tell. So if zombies were possible, we could never know that we are not zombies. And in that case, we could not know that we have experience. But that is insane and self-defeating, since it was our conviction in our knowledge of our own experience that drives this very intuition. It follows that this version of the problem of other minds makes no flippin' sense either. For these reasons, there can be no problem of other minds any more than there can be a problem of other dollars. To be a mind is not to house hidden inner particulars that have their character independent of how we understand them and that we somehow discover. It is to interpret and to be interpreted, to address and to be addressed, to participate in the complex human conversation, and to share a world with other participants. So, to know that others have minds is not to know that they have mysterious inner worlds, and to know that we have minds is to know that we are like those others. We each know immediately that we are minds not through introspection, but through participation. We know that others are minds not through inference and not through clairvoyance, but through co-participation. To allow ourselves to be addressed by or to address another is to take her to be a person, to have a mind. It is at the same time to take ourselves to be persons. This phenomenon of address requires neither reflexive self-consciousness, nor qualitative experience, nor interiority, nor autonomy, nor any of the other properties associated with selves. It only requires us to recognize each other as members of the same community, sharing the same world. But what is it to recognize ourselves and others to be members of a community of persons? It is, we shall see, to see one another as valuable, as objects of care and respect. And the deepest reason to forgo the myth of the self for the recognition of the reality of the person is that it is persons, not selves, that merit respect and care. Because it's all like string locations of string in the same web. We will close our investigation by considering this issue. All right. Like 5 more pages to the end of the book, gang. Persons and values. All of this allows us a new perspective on the big questions. What really matters? Why do we value one another? Why do we and our fellows merit respect, rights, consideration, and kindness? And kindness. Oh, you just typed V. You forgot to hold down control. That's funny. Got this ad on Kick. This guy said, he goes through these small channels and he's like, hey, I'll give you followers. And so you're supposed to do Command Control V. You just hit V and then send, because, they got to move quickly. Okay, so that is another reason. That is another way of asking the question, what is special about people? And this question leads to another. When we want to assign value to non-human entities like corporations, organizations, non-human animals, ecosystems, or rivers, what kind of status do we give them? Answering these questions reminds us of just how important personhood is and shows how irrelevant selves are to our moral and political life. Okay, so exciting. I just want to use blue for everything in this chapter. So we care about one another. Take one another's desires and welfare seriously, respect one another's rights, and treat one another with consideration. In short, we value one another to the degree that we embrace one another in a moral and social community. That is, moral valuation depends on seeing one another as together in a shared world. This does not require that we agree about everything or that our projects are the same. We can respect and honor those with whom we share little in the way of beliefs, values, or way of life. But this kind of moral respect and recognition does require that we see one another as potential fellows in a larger sense, as playing analogous roles in the human world, and so as potential addressees or addressors, more simply, as conversation partners. So, yeah, my opinion. The way that we talk about, like, my opinion, it's always bothered me, and I think, and maybe I'm just like projecting and conflating and whatever, but I think it's relevant to this, that there's this, like, we think that it's so special. I possess an opinion, and so that has like special value, as though, and and that opinion needs to like stay and be protected here, instead of a more, I don't know, flowy sense of knowledge and information. I don't know. So, But this kind of moral respect and recognition does require that we see one another as potential fellows in a larger sense, as playing analogous roles in the human world, and so as potential addressees or addressors, more simply as conversational partners. And conversation requires both a broadly shared background of concerns and presuppositions, and then also, well, originally, before I was thinking about the my opinion thing, I was thinking about science, right? And how valuable science is for discovering this world that we share, and how valuable philosophy is for agreeing on, understanding, delving into our conventions, determining, establishing. So, conversation requires both a broadly shared background of concerns and presuppositions and distinct vantage points or perspectives discernible against that shared background. As we have seen, it also presupposes that each party takes the other as one who can take seriously what the other says and who has something to tell the other. Our ability to care about others, including distant others we have never met, arises from our ability to see others as sharing in this grand project. For if the project in which we see ourselves as agents, the project of life, is sufficient to give meaning to our own lives, it is also sufficient to give meaning to those others who join us in that project. Just as Hamlet gains his significance in Hamlet, so too do Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and they matter to one another precisely because they are a part of the same drama. When we recognize each other in this sense, a kind of recognition absolutely fundamental to our collective lives, we recognize our interdependence, not our independence, our roles and commitments, not our subjectivity, our participation in a shared world, not our spectatorship of a world of which we are independent. Love that, love that, love that. In short, this kind of moral and political recognition is the recognition of persons, not of selves. And this is why it makes sense to think of organizations or natural phenomena as persons, as grounds for treating them with respect, or as grounds for the conferral of rights, even though it would make no sense whatsoever to assert that they have selves, even if we thought that we do. Santideva makes this point eloquently in How to Lead an Awakened Life. He argues that we can only cultivate attitudes of friendliness and care for others when we are able to project ourselves imaginatively into their situations, when we can regard others as our mothers, when we recognize our thoroughgoing interdependence with them, and when we abandon the fantasy that we and they are the agents of independent free action. When we do so, he argues, we come to see that suffering is bad, not because it is ours, but because it is bad per se, no matter whose it is, and that happiness is good, not just when it is ours, but wherever it arises, because it's all in the same drama. Okie dokie. This attitude of universal care is the foundation of genuine moral concern. When we adopt this attitude, we do not see ourselves and others as isolated, independent selves who happen to find one another in proximity in a featureless abstract landscape and then have to figure out whether and how to relate to one another. Instead, we see one another as persons who share a world pregnant with meaning, meaning that we collectively create and which in turn shapes our lives, defines us, our identities. And seeing one another in this way, we come to appreciate the way we constitute one another and the ways in which we are responsive and responsible to one another. Selves could never facilitate our moral or collective lives. They could only get in the way. That is why Dogen writes that to study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to cast off body and mind. To cast off body and mind is to be affirmed by all things. This affirmation is and can only be the affirmation of our shared personhood. Okay, I'm just going to retitle this because I do want each chapter to be its own thing.